Okay, we're going to begin our third panel of the event today, which is on the topic of political commons. Our first speaker is Professor Omar Dahbour, a professor of philosophy at Hunter College and Graduate Center of City University of New York. His most recent book is entitled Self-Determination Without Nationalism, and he is the author of many articles on global ethics, critical theory, and environmental philosophy. His forthcoming book is entitled Eco-Sovereignty, a Political Principle for the Environmental Crisis. And if I'm correct, I think he's in the final stages of finishing the manuscript, so we thank him for taking the trip out here to present on the topic of the political commons, and the title of his talk is Toward the Political Theory of the Commons. So, thank you.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks to the team for putting this wonderful conference together. I'm having a great time so far, and my talk is not incredibly long, and by the way, it's a theory talk, so my apologies, no pictures. It's not that I never do it, but I just didn't, I probably foolishly thought it wasn't necessary here. In any case, I hope to entertain you with some ideas for a few minutes. A couple of prefatory remarks. Just sitting here in the conference so far, couple of terms that keep being used, obviously the obvious one, commons, right? What does that mean? So let me just say a couple of words about my understanding or how I'm using the commons here, particularly three matters. One is that some of this I think agree with what Silvia Federici just said. So I see the commons as essentially local, and that means that I at least, though not everyone here I believe, takes the notion of a planetary commons as a contradiction in terms. So first, commons are, at least in the way that I use it, local. Secondly, they are communal. So again, to quote someone just mentioned, Maria Mies, she has an article called No Commons Without Community, or something to that effect. And that's my own view, that a commons, for instance, examples from this morning's talks about the deep ocean, I don't see as a commons, I see as what I believe Elinor Ostrom called open access zones. Precisely because they're not affiliated with a human community of some sort. And third, at least mainly, I see the commons as agrarian. That doesn't mean you can't have an urban commons. In fact, I mentioned it in a few minutes in my talk. But I do think commons has almost always is associated to some extent with the production of food for sustenance. And to have a commons that is completely disassociated from food production, I think, is in some ways problematic, or at least exceptional to a degree. We can talk more about that a little bit later. Secondly, the term that's been used quite a lot today, and I've, as you can see from the title of my forthcoming book, written a bit on it, is sovereignty. Sovereignty is not a big part of my comments here, but I love to talk about it. And I also have a very special concept. It's a non-absolutist, non-Hobbesian conception of sovereignty, which differs from the main understanding of that term. So perhaps we can talk about that a little bit later. And last comment is, again, following Sylvia's wonderful talk, I'd like to kind of dedicate this little presentation to the people I met in 2019 when I was invited to a food sovereignty conference in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. It was a Via Campesina conference. It was one of the great experiences of my intellectual and political engagement. And part of that was to actually meet functioning Palestinian agricultural commons. We went to the farms. They were maintaining a seed bank on the basis of this, and I can personally only hope that they're doing okay right now in the face of incredible repression. So let me say, now I'm going to make 5 points relatively quickly, and I'll just flag them as we go. The general idea is that I'm trying to find ideas that are hopefully useful and usable from the history of political philosophy to begin to talk about what a political theory of the commons would even be. And that the very idea of a political theory of the commons, I think, is in some ways contestable or certainly unusual. The one-line summary is, well, there are not many ideas we can use from the history of political philosophy. It may be a couple. And so in conclusion, I'll mention three that I find useful. So the first section, a brief comment on states, and unfortunately, Sylvia didn't get around to talking about states, but I'll say a couple of words about it. States and why they're so unreliable as agents for dealing with environmental problems. So states have traditionally been almost the exclusive focus of philosophers in terms of establishing the legitimacy of political authority. Markets have been considered only to the extent that they can provide a distributive mechanism for economic goods and services that the state itself can't readily provide. And of course, small-scale forms of political organization, such as common property institutions, if in fact they even are forms of political organization, have received scant consideration and certainly almost none as possible claimants to political authority or sovereignty. Yet from a contemporary environmentalist perspective that examines political institutions, at least in part, for their ability to achieve goals of ecological sustainability and resilience, states are deeply compromised. And this is the result, I think, of their complicity in practices and policies of extractivism, which I'll just define generally as the systematic mining of goods and services provided in intact ecosystems for their potential as sources of so-called natural resources. Now, while markets have been the primary drivers of ecocide as the venues for commodification and capitalization of natural goods, states have played a secondary but still vital role in furthering these processes. This is the case for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is the role that states have played in capitalist economies as enablers of various strategies of capital accumulation. Another reason is the benefits that accrue for states themselves through the efficient transformation and use of resources that can be directly used for state projects such as infrastructural development or military procurement. And this is in addition to the indirect benefits of taxable revenues derived from private resource extraction. These aspects of state complicity in extractivism I don't think are coincidental or elective features of state authority. There are virtually no cases of states that I'm aware of anyway, even when they're rhetorically committed to sustainability or resilience policies, that is, examples of states refusing opportunities to develop and capitalize natural goods from, the examples, coal mining, oil drilling, commercial forestry, fishing. This includes, of course, as you know very, very well, South American countries that even do have a rhetorical commitment to sustainability and yet go ahead anyway, as it were. So first point is the unreliability of states. Second, the question is about social movements that are aiming at either defending or establishing commons and how they may be different from the kinds of social movements that political theorists have historically discussed. So consequently, it's been left to social movements based on substate and usually agrarian populations who seek alternative uses for natural goods and services to oppose the extractivist practices of both market-oriented businesses and state agencies allied with them. It has so far been an unequal conflict due to the well-financed and often heavily militarized expropriation of resources by states and corporations. But as I argue here, another problem with resistance to extractivism is the relatively organic, ad hoc, and unpolitical nature of the resistance to date. This is now changing, and it's a purpose of this talk to further the process of politicizing resistance to extractivism so as to increase its effectiveness and durability. So two movements in particular have been notable in this regard. At least one of them has been mentioned recently, the food sovereignty movement beginning in the 1990s, and various struggles for indigenous rights, an idea, of course, which has a much older provenance. These movements have important differences from other social movements based on working class or other social group organizing. Workers' organizations, whether focused on unionization or on broader conceptions of workers' control of production, have usually been oriented to states. They have sought state recognition of unionization or have fought for state ownership of enterprises, whether or not as a way station to direct workers' control. Other social movements, often based on identities of one sort or another, have generally aimed at either redistributive schemes pertaining to income or investment imposed by states, or recognitive policies, such as preferential treatment in employment or education, again enforced by state actions. Food sovereignty and indigenous rights movements, on the other hand, have a more distanced relation to states, often attempting to protect or reimpose sub-state regimes of common property ownership. And for these struggles, states have been viewed as playing a generally oppressive part, and the goal is often to remove them as much as possible from direct governance of lands and waters necessary for local and indigenous subsistence. So there's a fundamental difference between these sorts of movements. The first analyzed and part of political theory, the second largely not. So third point, why is the commons so absent from political philosophy? Efforts to do this, to theorize these new movements, efforts to do this have had to proceed without almost any conceptual support from political theorists. This is the result of the absence of thinking about commons institutions in philosophy, political philosophy, at least until quite recently. And I think there are two reasons for this. The first reason is that political philosophy has had a persistently urban bias. I don't think I'm probably telling anyone things you can't guess at or know. There are two, the urban bias has existed in the most obvious way from Aristotle at least to Rousseau, right? The city-state has been regarded by most philosophers as the principal venue for political authority. But even when the concept of the state grew beyond the city as such to become the sovereign territorial state, such a state found its rationale in the ability to mobilize resources across a larger region to enable the construction of infrastructure for an incipient urban industrial society. Agrarian life and institutions, to the extent they were considered at all, were regarded as providing a naturalistic basis for political and indeed for cultural life lived in predominantly urban settings. A second reason, when the country-city relation was regarded at all, especially by such early modern thinkers as Locke and Smith, as an appropriate subject for theorization, it was generally in order to make the case for reorganizing land tenure to facilitate urban and/or industrial development. So the most well-known concept to apply this thinking, as you know, is that of enclosures, which itself provides a sort of theorization and justification for extractivism avant la lettre. Is there anything else in this history? Yes, I think there are a couple of partial exceptions. And these exceptions go under the names of Rousseau and Marx, at least in part. I'll mention Hegel a little bit at the end. These two thinkers in particular stand out for their use of concepts that might suggest some space, and this is, I think, where the commons has to live, some space between the idea of political authority and the institution of the state. Rousseau's idea of the people manifested in the creation of a general will is an important innovation in the theory of political legitimacy. Yet, its institutional embodiment has always been a puzzle. What and/or where does the people exist in a form separate from the state, such that the general will can take shape prior to subsumption under state-oriented practices and procedures? Depending on your preferred interpretation of Rousseau, this answer has either no answer, this question has no answer, or is answered through the equation of a general will with some sort of participatory democratic institutions. But I'd like to suggest a different sort of answer might be that commons institutions could fulfill some of the functions of a political but non-state instantiation of people's will. One idea. Similarly, Marx's idea of the working class as a politically conscious collective agent that first takes control of industrial production and second occupies and transforms state institutions is a concept that has never been, at least in my view, satisfactorily articulated, much less embodied historically. Aside from the well-known quandaries about class consciousness and its relation to elites, how are we to understand the actual institutional forms in which such assertions of working class power would give rise? Perhaps we can see Marx's idea as a proposal for what could be called an industrial commons, a form of control by users of common property that is public and therefore political in a way that private property regimes cannot be. A modest proposal. Final point, what can we draw from this history to begin to theorize the political commons? Three ideas or three concepts. The first one is whether a commons is industrial, agrarian, as I think most of them are, or infrastructural in terms of community land trusts or urban housing commons, its rationale has to be one of stewardship of natural goods and services to achieve long-term ecological sustainability and resilience, sorry. Given the complicity of state structures with extractivism, we badly need a new idea of political authority, something beyond the concept of property ownership, I would argue, that can provide a counterweight to state and corporate power. So stewardship is the first of these ideas. Secondly, and this is what I mentioned earlier, those peoples and groups seeking to protect or construct common property regimes need to claim sovereignty over the ecosystems or other natural goods and services necessary to maintain ecological sustainability and discharge their duties of stewardship. Now, sovereignty in this iteration would be equivalent to the notion of ultimate authority, but it would be, as mentioned, non-absolutist sovereignty in two senses. On the one hand, it would be limited in scope in the sense that no claims to exclusive control or authority over territory are necessary, I believe. Sovereignty could be shared with a governmental authority as long as the idea of limited authority was accepted by both institutions. On the other hand, sovereignty would be, and this is the second sense, would be functional in the sense that the maintenance of ecosystems and the livelihoods of people dependent upon them would be the purpose and the extent of sovereign power. And in that sense, the role of the commons would be limited to discharging those functions, but wouldn't necessarily claim sovereignty beyond that. At least I think that's what I would argue. Finally, third, and this is where a little bit of Hegel helps, the authority of common property regimes requires recognition within state constitutions in order to provide a means of working out the relationship between potentially rival sources of political authority. The political commons, as I'm calling it here, if it's legitimated by the concepts just mentioned, may come to be an institution that can halt and reverse some of the destruction of natural environments that has resulted from the collusion of both states and markets in extractivism and ecocide. At least that's my hope. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Ashley Dawson, an author, activist, and professor of English at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and the College of Staten Island. Ashley works for the abolition of fossil fuels and a democratic energy transition as a member of the Public Power New York campaign and founder of the Public Power Observatory. Recently published books of his include Environmentalism from Below, People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons, Extreme Cities, and Extinction, A Radical History. Ashley is also the co-editor of the essay collection Decolonize Conservation. This year, Ashley is the Climate Justice Fellow at Culture Push, a New York-based arts organization, as well as a Red Natural History Fellow with the artist activist group, the Natural History Museum. The title of his talk today is Landback, Indigenous Sovereignty and the Fight to Decolonize Conservation. Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks so much, Nicole. I'm going to see if I can get this setup working. That doesn't work. What am I trying to plug in? This one or this one? Does anybody know? Not that one. Does this go into this?
This one? Yes.
Okay.
This
So I'll take mine out.
into that. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you
Do you
very
wanna
much.
check it?
Yes.
Sure. Yep.
Okay. Okay, well, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks to Sigu for the whole Sigu team for all the work that you've done to make this happen. As always, a lot of your work, I'm sure, is invisible, but we benefit a great deal from it. And, you know, you're creating an intellectual and academic commons for us So thank you for that. So I want to start off by saying that the land we're gathered on today is the original homeland and traditional territory of the Kickapoo, the Peoria, the Bode-Wad-Miakiwin, the Miami, and the Osheti-Sakowin people. I say this because it's important to acknowledge that we're on stolen land, and that should be the foundation for any conversations we have about the commons, but also because the theft of that land is not something that's just happened in the past. It continues in the present, and in fact, as Silvia Federici illuminated for us so powerfully in her presentation, it's actually speeding up in a way that is extremely perturbing and that people are fighting back against. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. That is the struggle for land back by indigenous movements. And I should just situate myself. I was born in 1965 in Cape Town, South Africa, so I'm the descendant of a long line of settler colonial people. I have been lucky, though, to be working alongside indigenous folks as a Red Natural History Fellow, and also through the collection of essays that I published called Decolonize Conservation, that is a compendium of radical arguments put together by indigenous people and allies. So what I'm saying today is informed by those encounters, but obviously I come from where I come from, and my apologies to all of you and all the people I'm in dialogue for any mistakes that I may make. Okay, so let me give you a very quick overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk about who controls the commons, moratorium on carbon offsets, a brief history of nature-based climate solutions, the 30-30 plan as a mammoth global land grab, and arguably also the biggest geoengineering project that the world has ever seen, and then decolonize conservation and land back. And I know that's a lot. I put a timer on, so I'll try and stick to the 15 minutes. Okay, so as you'll probably know, we're in the midst of a massive biodiversity crisis. In fact, there's a UN process parallel to the climate conferences focused on the biodiversity crisis. And it's become quite well known, at least among indigenous folks and their allies, that indigenous people's sovereignty, their control of their traditional territories, is absolutely crucial to coping with the biodiversity crisis. So one now well-known fact is that although indigenous people comprise less of than 5% of the world's population and live on roughly a quarter of the habitable land in the world, they protect 80% of global biodiversity. So the question of indigenous sovereignty is absolutely important, and thinking about the way that it's being undermined and eroded today is hugely consequential. In fact, negotiations going on right now within the UN process for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement have to do with various forms of carbon markets. And at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York City a couple of weeks ago, the UN Permanent Rapporteur on Indigenous Issues called for a moratorium on carbon markets. Really important, and he's echoing the work of many other indigenous activists. Why is it so important to have a moratorium on carbon markets? Obviously, carbon markets are very much a buzzword today in contemporary capitalism. I'm sure most of you all know what carbon markets are, but here's a nice little schema that kind of gives you a sense of what happens. Industries pollute, emitting CO2. They take some of the money that they're generating through realization of capital, and they invest it in things like reforestation projects, which absorb carbon dioxide, and also produce these lovely things called carbon credits that can be traded. Now, thinking about these carbon offsets and what's happening in relation to indigenous issues is hugely important, because one of the primary ways in which carbon offsets are functioning today is through the establishment of so-called protected areas. These are essentially national parks, right? Think Yosemite or something like that, all around the world. These protected areas are supposed to generate carbon credits, that polluters can buy to offset their emissions. This gets touted in international forums all around the world as a kind of win-win solution, right? So we need to generate more protected areas, which will lead to more climate change mitigation. So everyone benefits from that. But what I want to argue is that in reality, it's a kind of spatial fix for a totally unsustainable capitalist system that is displacing its key contradictions to the global south and first and foremost to indigenous people and their territories. And therefore, we really need to fight it and be aware of how it manifests. Now, some of its manifestations are patently ridiculous. Like, for instance, Shell with this picture of a BMW or something talking about driving towards or delivering a carbon neutral future. Okay, so that's evidently completely ludicrous. But some of the manifestations are a little bit harder to track and understand. So here's the World Economic Forum talking about how forests could be natural climate solutions. Where does this idea of the natural climate solution, or also known as nature-based solutions, come from? Well, it seems to be a benign idea, right? Supporting natural ecosystems can help fight climate change because things like trees or soils and peat bogs absorb carbon dioxide. So you can see it's a form of carbon offsetting, essentially. What's the history of this argument about nature-based solutions? Well, a lot of the hype around it comes from a 2017 paper published in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, whose lead author was Bronson Griscom. And you can see that he talks about how these natural climate solutions can absorb, he and his colleagues estimated, up to about 30% of carbon emissions. Well, who is this Bronson Griscom? If you look into the back notes to the paper, you find out that he works for the Nature Conservancy, one of the big conservation organizations based in the US. Remember, this paper was published in 2017. Turns out in 2016, the Nature Conservancy was hyping nature-based climate solutions as the forgotten climate solution. And this argument gets picked up by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is a kind of big umbrella organization that includes all of these US-based conservation organizations, like the WWF, for instance, as well as business outfits of various different kinds, sort of green business outfits. And they pick up these same ideas about 30% of carbon emissions being absorbed through nature-based climate solutions. And then all of this kind of metastasizes through the UN Biodiversity Conference process in Montreal a year and a half ago, where there's a proposal to turn 30% of the world's surface into protected areas by 2030, right? So the sort of buzzword is 30 by 30. So this idea of nature-based solutions as a way in which the capitalist system can continue, but we can cope with it through absorption of carbon with setting aside increasing amounts of the world's surface as protected areas or national parks is getting a huge amount of traction internationally as the climate crisis deepens. And it's also getting a whole lot of attention from global finance. So here's a meeting that was held in 2022 about scaling finance for nature, forging philanthropy finance government partnerships. So you can really see how this effort to turn nature into a commodity and value it is getting a lot of traction. And so what I would argue is essentially big conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy see dollar signs. You know, they see the possibility for themselves to become the intermediaries between global finance, big corporations that continue to pollute, and this effort to cope with the climate crisis by commodifying natural ecosystems all over the world and having them absorb carbon. What's the problem with all of this? Well, it turns out that it just doesn't work, right? So studies have revealed that about 90% of rainforest carbon offsets that have been actually certified, because there's now a whole industry in certifying these things, are absolutely worthless. not only do they not work, but they also displace indigenous people. So this study called Blood Carbon by Survival International looked at an initiative in northern Kenya called the Northern Rangelands Trust that claimed to be educating traditional pastoral people about how to limit the grazing of their animals to specific areas so that crops or green areas would regrow in the interstitial times when the animals were not grazing in that land. First of all, not that much green space really was regrown. And in addition, the indigenous herders had to be kept from going in the routes that they were used to inhabiting through violence, right? So through the appointment of militarized armed rangers. That's where the idea of blood carbon comes from, right? So protected areas, such as parks, mean state violence against indigenous people. I'm not talking about just one case. I'm talking about systematic state violence against indigenous people all around the world. So when we think about 30 by 30, 30% of the planet's surface set aside by 2030, we're really thinking about a massive transformation of sovereignty and massive enclosure of the indigenous commons all around the world. And we need to see it in those terms because, of course, the way it's being couched is as this very benevolent new form of kind of protected area, a kind of state-based, internationally sanctioned, finance-backed form of commons. So I'm talking about different rhetorics around the commons and different processes of governing and controlling the commons. So I want to argue, along with my allies in indigenous communities, that we need to decolonize conservation, and this needs to be seen as an extremely important task that not that many people seem to be aware of today, given the ways in which the climate crisis and carbon emissions gain so much attention. As I hope I've made clear, in fact, what's happening is that the biodiversity crisis and conservation are being intimately connected to the climate crisis and pitched by big finance and conservation organizations as one of the main solutions to the climate crisis. So what does it mean to decolonize conservation? It means that governments and corporations must phase out fossil fuels and abandon attempts to greenwash their emissions through false claims that nature-based offsetting and other forms of carbon offsetting will mitigate climate change. So we really need to embrace the idea of a moratorium on carbon offsets and kind of add our voices to the indigenous groups who I cited at the outset of my presentation. And all of this is really important because Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is being negotiated basically at the moment and will be decided on this autumn. In addition, the international community must agree to a complete halt in the creation of new protected areas, which exclude indigenous and local communities. Protected areas are a colonial invention. They come out of settler colonialism. They're inherently violent, and they, with basically no exceptions, do not include really significant forms of indigenous sovereignty. Only about 1% of protected areas globally include genuine forms of free, prior, and informed consent and indigenous control over the land where they're established. And lastly, governments must fully respect, protect, and uphold indigenous peoples' land and forest rights, respect collective customary land and forest use by local communities, which tends to be invisibilized by nation states and international agencies. Governments must ensure protection of this customarily controlled land in accordance with the wishes of communities. This should be the primary means of protecting biodiversity throughout the world. And I think that means that, again, we need to come back to the idea of land back. This demand is at the forefront of Native American communities' political mobilization in recent years, and it's also, as my abstract for this conference talks about, it's also a demand that's gaining traction in communities, indigenous communities all around the world. What might this demand look like in practical terms? Well, one argument might be to return all the national parks to the tribes. I mean, after all the land we're on in the United States is stolen land. We could start by returning the national parks to the tribes. That's a total area of approximately 52.4 million acres, and it would mean that decolonization would be something other than just rhetoric, and that land acknowledgements wouldn't be empty performative gestures by university officials, as they all too often are. And then beyond that, we might also consider returning all federal lands. The federal government manages 640 million acres of land in the United States. And there have been previous movements to take back some of that land from state control and return it into the hands of the populace. Usually those have been right-wing white settler colonial movements like the Sagebrush Rebellion. But there are precedents for trying to take this land out of state hands. So we might think about building movements that insist on that kind of a transformation and really take the demand of land back seriously. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you all so much for your attention.
Our next speaker is Professor Robert Nichols, Professor of History of Consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His work in social and political thought has been published in numerous books and articles, including most recently Theft is Property, Dispossession and Critical Theory by Duke University Press, and a translation of The Dispossessed by Daniel Ben-Said. The title of his talk today is Exclosure, a Predicament of Modern Power. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here and speak with you today. It's a great honor to be here. I very much appreciate it. And thanks, too, to my fellow panelists. I've learned an enormous amount already today, so I'm really appreciative of this learning opportunity. And I also want to make a special thank you to the people whose names are not on the program, all the people whose work goes into making events like these possible, the booking of the hotels and flights, and people who have to pack up the chairs afterwards. So thank you to all of you. So I am also a theorist, so I do not have visual aids, and my talk will be at a higher level of generality or abstraction. And I'm going to focus on one particular concept that is usually paired with the concept of the commons, and that is enclosure. And I'm specifically going to talk about the relationship between enclosure and what I'm going to call here exclosure. Over the course of several centuries, Western imperial capitalism has been largely successful in generalizing one model of mediating and organizing human relationships to land. This model envisions that the optimal way to relate to the earth is by apportioning it into distinct geospatial zones of exclusive control. This is expressed in two main ways, or at two main levels of operation: territorial sovereignty and landed property. On the first, nation-states are organized into bounded units with borders, and the supreme governing authority of a given people, sovereignty, is expressed spatially as absolute control over a given terrestrial zone. On the second, individuals within states are able to acquire ownership over space in the form of landed property, to which they are said to have special rights to exclude others from use and access. For many key thinkers and proponents of this model, the territorial sovereignty of states is expressly analogized to the private property ownership of individuals, and vice versa, since both of these articulate an ideal of exclusive control within a defined space. Now, over the course of many decades, it's become common for academics and activists alike to describe the long, complex process by which this particular model of relating to the earth became hegemonic as the enclosures of the commons. This phrase is indebted first to the important role that the Enclosures Acts played in the transformation of feudal England and its emergence as a global capitalist and imperialist power. The terminology appears in Marx's analysis of so-called primitive accumulation in Part 8 of Volume 1 of Capital, but was popularized and generalized into a much more wide-reaching metaphor by works such as E.P. Thompson's Customs in Commons, the writings of the Midnight Notes Collective, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's trilogy of Empire, Multitude, and Commonwealth, to just name a few prominent examples. For many of these thinkers, the rise of territorial sovereignty and landed property could be thought of as a long series of enclosures. Now, one oddity about the use of the term enclosure to describe territorial demarcation of the earth is that it is commonly used interchangeably with another term that would appear to be distinct, perhaps even its opposite, namely exclusion. At the purely semantic level, enclose and exclude appear to be contrasting terms, since the first denotes the process of closing something in, whereas the second suggests keeping something out. The nearly interchangeable use of these terms might be dismissed as a semantic triviality, however, because, at least in a certain context, it's entirely possible that they could be referring to, in fact, the same empirical phenomenon, just from two different vantage points. The organization of the earth into zones of exclusive territorial control could, in fact, enclose something while simultaneously excluding something else. If so, then the fact that these two seemingly different words are used to describe the same action or event is not a mistake, but actually a feature of the phenomenon under description. Put differently, the notion of enclosure that is used in this context is a dialectical one, in that it already implies its seeming opposite as the corollary of the same unified process. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters, I think, because much work on colonialism and the forms of resistance that it engenders continues to operate, I think, with a decidedly non-dialectical conception of these processes. This is manifest in the desire to find an outside to the process in the form of non-Western, often indigenous forms of life that reject notions of territorial sovereignty and landed property, and more generally do not relate to the earth as a spatial zone of exclusion. However, when this search for an outside in the form of non-exclusionary relations to the earth proceeds in a manner that obscures or obfuscates the dialectical nature of enclosures, it risks, I think, becoming philosophically incoherent, politically problematic, or both. So I'll try to explain by way of an illustrative example. A swath of recent work, originally devised in anthropology but spreading throughout the humanities and social sciences, has been characterized recently by an ontological turn. Often drawing upon or inspired by the work of Latin American school of decoloniality or the alternative ontologies and earth beings framework, which also derives out of a Latin American context, to just choose two prominent examples where this language is most used. This research aspires to capture the radical alterity of, in particular, indigenous worlds without reducing them to classical terms of previous Western analysis. Most notably, thinkers in this tradition argue that we should not conceptualize indigenous relationships to land as merely cultural or even epistemological. That is, we should not understand these relationships to land and the non-human world as ideas, values, or perspectives held in the mind of indigenous peoples, but rather should approach them as ontological in the sense of relating to a holistic world, especially pertaining to reality and the entities that exist within it. Now, this approach has obvious implications for how we relate to land. Researchers aim to demonstrate that many indigenous communities do not conceptualize or relate to the earth as either territory or property. The communities do not experience the earth as a grid of demarcated space over which a person or a group of persons could claim exclusive control. In many of these alternative indigenous ontologies, the earth is a complex living web of living relations, entangled with kinship, intergenerational community, with divinity or spirituality. It's not simply that the land is bound up in and productive of human social relations, although that may also be the case, but rather that the land itself, or certain land forms, along with various flora and fauna, are understood as other than human persons, imbued with agency, even sentience. In its capacity as a person, land can be a powerful actor in its own right. More directly related to the central topic under discussion here, these alternative worlds reject and refuse the exclusionary model of territorial sovereignty and landed property. In place of sovereignty, property, exclusion, and control, they embrace and advocate for openness, inclusion, reciprocal sharing, and the like. Theirs is a radically non-exclusionary land ethos or ontology. Now, I am entirely sympathetic to any project that rejects the exclusionary model of territory and property, and or points us to real or potential alternatives to these. As many others have already commented on today, at this point in the 21st century, finding new ways of organizing human relationships to the earth is more than an interesting and speculative endeavor, it's an existential imperative. However, proponents of this ontological approach, I think, misapprehend the nature of the dilemma that face alternative worlds, and in so doing, I think also risk undermining their own cause. This misapprehension, I'll suggest here, is twofold. It arises first out of a failure to conceptualize enclosure dialectically, and second, a failure to grasp the predicament of power that this dialectical process engenders. So to dramatize a dialectical conception of the process, I offered in my written remarks here a little parable, and now I'm like reticent to say parable because Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons was literally described as a parable earlier, and I do not wish to associate myself with him. But in the written form, I try to imagine a sort of scenario just to visually dramatize the kind of problem that I'm thinking about. So imagine that there is a man. Call him the first man. The first man sets out to build himself a home. He erects 4 walls around himself. This man thinks that he is constructing a space for himself, but by closing out others, he is simultaneously constructing a second home for them, one the size of the rest of the earth. The man thinks that he is enclosing himself, but at the same time, he is enclosing the world. Others arrive. They envy the first man his home and begin to build houses of their own. Soon, the whole of the earth is enclosed, except for one small square of unclaimed land. Eventually, there is only one person who holds out. Call him the last man. He is the one who did not build a house. As the others build, he finds himself on smaller and smaller units of land to live on, until one day he is standing on the last unclaimed open space, one that is roughly the size of a house. At best, he has become indistinguishable from the others. At worst, they hate him, accusing him of stealing the last piece of the commons, of keeping it for himself. Now, the parable is meant to depict a basic point, that to delimit an internal space is always already to shape an external space. As the process of enclosing the earth gets generalized, those who would live in an alternative world, without an enclosed interior space, end up with a de facto replication of the very enclosure they seek to resist. In other words, because enclosure is a dialectical or a relational process, constituting both inside and outside at once, it can impose itself on others even without them participating in it directly. Holdouts end up with an open space exactly the size of a closed house. Call this de facto last space an exclosure. So exclosure here is referring to a kind of zone of resistance against enclosure, the defense of which appears to entail a logical contradiction or an act of hypocrisy, insofar as it entails enforcing boundedness in the name of open use and common sharing. This, I think, is the conundrum facing many indigenous peoples who wish to live on the earth in a non-exclusionary way. They end up living in an open space of non-exclusionary relations that is de facto identical to territorial sovereignty or landed property. Indian reservations or indigenous autonomous zones are concrete examples of such exclosures. Now, this is not just an abstract or an arcane problem. Rather, it's, I think, a very practical problem and manifests in real-world dilemmas. It does so because the dialectic of enclosure-exclosure generates also a predicament of power. And this is the second point that I think the ontological perspective tends to elide. As many others here have noted, territorial sovereignty and landed property are not just ideas. They're the outgrowth of certain organizational forms, namely the state and the market. In these two dominant forms, practices of relating to the earth as spaces of enclosure-exclosure are linked to organizational forms that facilitate the amplification and concentration of power. This means that exclusionary forms of relating to the earth have the added benefit of being more enforceable, which generates a predicament of power for those who would resist it. Call this the dilemma of exclusionary power. To illustrate, let me return to the parable. When the first man builds a house, he also begins to build power. This is because he's able to use the enclosed space to generate new capacities. For instance, ownership over space can be used as collateral against a loan, which can then be used to purchase more space, so it is generative of capital. Put more generally then, this first man adopts an organizational form, the aim of which is to amplify and centralize power such that he may more efficiently execute his will. Now the last man eschews this, opting for an organizational form that disperses power or is perhaps oriented towards other values and organizing principles altogether, such as harmony, peace, piety, or the like. Now the encounter between these two kinds of claim, one person claiming exclusionary right and another person claiming non-exclusion then, is not just a kind of logical contradiction between two claims, but what I'm suggesting is that the first claim is necessarily connected to a kind of enforcement capacity that the second claim lacks. The encounter between them then generates a dilemma for the last man, because once the first man claims exclusionary power over a given space, those who are living within that space who wish to deny or invalidate that claim are faced with a puzzle of how to generate resistance to it without becoming the very thing that they wish to defy. Either they remain true to their alternative form of life, in which case they have a lack of power relative to the first party, or they begin to aggregate and amplify power as a means of resisting the intruders, but in so doing, they begin to replicate them. Either way, it appears the exclusionary organizational form tends to win out in the long run. This, I think, is a dilemma of resisting exclusionary power. It is, I think, at least a plausible rendering of the whole long process by which Europe was slowly reorganized into a system of territorial sovereignty and landed property. And more to the point, it's also part of the conundrum that faced post-colonial societies as they formally decoupled from European imperial powers over the course of the 19th and 20th century around the world. This is at least part of the story as to why the state and the market have been universalized, and why societies with otherwise very different cultural or religious backgrounds have ended up looking so similar from a formal standpoint. It isn't because these non-Western peoples have been culturally assimilated into a Western worldview or an ontology, but because the dilemma of encountering exclusionary power can drive one paradoxically into reproducing it even as you resist it. In my view, then, this dialectical account of enclosure-exclosure and its related predicament of power is a superior framework to the ontological one. Adherents of the ontological perspective have a hard time explaining how and why indigenous communities end up having to defend their lands in a manner that appears de facto to replicate precisely the logic of territorial sovereignty and/or landed property. Put less charitably, the ontological approach risks seeing exclusionary practices only as examples of hypocrisy or assimilation, since when indigenous communities in question defend their lands by forcibly excluding outsiders, they appear to betray their commitment to openness and inclusive relationality. The dialectical approach proposed here explains this differently. I see all forms of inclusive openness as both logically and practically requiring forms of exclusion, since at minimum, we must exclude the excluders. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for these wonderful talks. I have a few questions or comments that I'd like to pose to the panelists, but also encourage you to use this opportunity to respond to anything that you'd like in the other presentations today, and then open it up to Q&A. So the first question is about different conceptions of sovereignty, which we've seen not only in this panel, but also throughout the conference. So I'm curious how each of you are defining this concept of sovereignty. In particular, Professor Dahbour, you put forward a sort of stipulative account of sovereignty that's not Hobbesian, it's not absolutist, it has this principle of sustainability built into it. So I was wondering if that might respond to some of the concerns in Professor Nichols' paper about how the political commons might reproduce the sort of what you call the exclusionary logic of forms of territorial sovereignty. My second question is about the role of rewilding in relation to the political commons, and I think this relates mostly to Professor Dawson's paper. You raised these great points about green grabbing and conservation efforts, but I wonder if you think there's some exceptions to that sometimes. So if repopulating an area might not be advantageous for efforts towards increasing biodiversity, and how to kind of think about those trade-offs within these political struggles. And then lastly, exclusion. It seems if we go with Dahbour and also Federici's and me's account of the commons as only existing within a community of users, it seems that that's necessarily going to be exclusionary. There's users and non-users, and it can only exist within a kind of local community. So I'd be curious, because it seems there's been other concerns about it, the commons being exclusionary, how we can kind of fit those two ideas together. But again, also, I'm sure you have other thoughts about different aspects of the talks, so I'd be happy to give you the opportunity to respond to one another.
Great. Should I go first? Or?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Obviously, we need to talk about some stuff, including other people who've brought up the sovereignty concept here. My most general definition of sovereignty is ultimate authority. I think it's a constitutive feature of all political action or all collective action. So, if you have goals that you want to accomplish through collective action, I think you either implicitly or explicitly use some conception of sovereignty. But that being said, I like to disambiguate the term a bit and try to look at different meanings. And as I suggested, I think it's possible to not have perhaps a narrowly exclusive conception of territorial sovereignty only, but also a functional conception of sovereignty, which might be held by certain agencies, whether they are commons or otherwise, who have the ultimate authority over certain functions, functional matters, such as, say, ecological sustainability, for instance. So I can conceive of a situation where sovereignty is shared, as I suggested, between, say, commons and states, with states having certain authority, ultimate authority over certain functions, commons having ultimate authority over other functions. And obviously my view is that matters having to do with the maintenance of ecosystems should be lodged with commons organizations rather than with states. So I guess if I would respond to your talk, I would encourage you to say whether you think these concepts, sovereignty and also property, for that matter, can be differentiated in this way. With the property concept also, I would ask about it. Aren't many of the features that you identify quite rightly as problematic features not of property regimes at all, but of private property regimes, so that common property regimes might escape some of the dilemmas that you've focused on.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, these are great questions. So I think the way I approach the question is a little bit different from how many approach it, because as a political theorist, I'm really centrally concerned not just with the concepts, but with what I'm calling like the enforcement capacity and differential enforcement capacity. So by that, what I mean is I think actually just in the history of European political thought is replete with examples of non-exclusionary forms of territorial use and jurisdiction, but also different forms of property, common property, public property,
To me, the problem is not that we lack ideas of alternative ways. These are, as many people have already mentioned, there's a multiplicity of these, and historically speaking, they're the norm rather than the exception, right? So it's not that we lack ideas around them. The problem, as I see it, is that when there is multiple forms of use coexisting in a given space, it leads to conflict. And conflict leads then backwards into the question of who or what will have the ultimate authority to resolve that conflict. And that's not just a conceptual problem of where does sovereignty lie, but it is really, in a sense, an empirical question. Because it's a question of who has the ability to enforce the decision around the use, around conflicting claims. So we can say that sovereignty is disarticulated and that there are differentiated forms of sovereignty, but what will end up happening, that's fine as long as the different jurisdictional groups don't conflict. But as soon as they conflict, then someone has to arbitrate over it. And the question of sovereignty really is the question of who has the ultimate enforcement capacity over that final point of arbitration. And this appears to put people who want to argue for, myself included, who want to argue for cooperative, disaggregated forms of use and access, various forms of commoning, it appears to put us in a kind of dilemma, because which is both logical and I think practical. The logical dilemma is it appears that at some point we have to be in favor of some form of exclusive sovereignty, because we have to enforce at some point the ability to exclude those who would exclude us. And that means we have to build power in order to have enforcement capacity. We have to be able to, at some point, say this is where this dispute will stop. That the people, the commoners, the demos, has the ability to make that decision and not some private corporation or some other unit. And so that appears like a logical contradiction, because we've said we're in favor not of exclusive sovereignty, but at some point we have to, in a sense, exercise it. And so that seems to catch us up on the horns of a dilemma. We appear to be like hypocrites in that moment. But I want to say there's a way of formulating that so that we can say that is a result of the predicament that we've been driven into, not a result of our inconsistency of our claims, but rather because of exclusionary people, they push non-exclusionary forms of relationships into that kind of predicament. And so we do have to eventually make a claim for the right, and not just the right, but the capacity to have final arbitration over this. Otherwise, our shared use and so on has no teeth, it has no power. And that's why it's a predicament of power, not just a kind of logical predicament, I think. And I think that a lot of kind of leftist movements rightly are looking for alternative forms of shared use and shared practice, but try to disavow then the problem of final enforcement. And I think ultimately the problem of enforcement is central to the question both of property and of sovereignty, because the question is not what do you claim, but what do you do when your claims conflict with someone else's claims?
I would like to take a very brief stab at the question of sovereignty and then try and segue into your question of rewilding. So this conversation is fascinating, and it's very exciting to be around two political philosophers, of which I am not, clearly. I tend to think about these questions historically, and the cases that I'm familiar with, I think, do resonate with the problems that the two of you are talking about, right? So we have this idea of 30 by 30, right? Proliferating protected areas, which is done in the name of the kind of the planetary commons, right? You know, the good of humanity on some level. And yet it always has to be done because of indigenous movements and the victories that they've won, like the passage of the Declaration of Indigenous Rights, UNDRIP, you know, it has to be done by giving lip service to indigenous sovereignty of one kind or another. So you get these sort of mixed formations in many protected areas, sort of saying that, you know, we will have the nation state set aside this area. There will be armed enforcement, but the indigenous people who've traditionally lived on the land will have some role in co-management or something like that. As I mentioned, only in about 1% of worldwide cases of protected areas do indigenous people actually have genuine forms of sovereignty. So, I mean, what that suggests is that, you know, the kind of enclosures that reservations in the United States represent, you know, which were violently imposed on indigenous people, just as citizenship in the U.S. state was imposed on indigenous people. You know, this is a kind of form which is replicating worldwide. And I want to look at other cases, like, for instance, Brazil, where the forms of sovereignty, of indigenous sovereignty that are embedded in the Constitution were won as a result of a whole series of social movements mobilizing in tandem. So yeah, I have a lot of learning to do by looking at different particular cases of sovereignty and then trying to think them through the way the two of you are doing in such, I think, generative ways. In terms of rewilding, I mean, theoretically, rewilding sounds great. The problem is that the main model for these projects of rewilding is the United Nations Protocol on Reforestation and Prevention of Forest Destruction. It's called REDD, is the acronym. And that's the basic sort of model for most carbon offsetting schemes. So the idea was, you know, you would set aside territory to preserve the forest in some nation state, and by doing that, it would absorb carbon. Well, it turns out that most of the territory set aside was in the global south, and in many cases, what would happen is that states would give concessions to logging companies, mining companies, oil companies from the US, Canada, Europe to come in and exploit that land. In the case of sort of logging companies, you know, they put up industrial tree farms. So they were, in some sense, sort of, you know, changing the landscape and adding more trees, but it was always along this line of industrial transformation of the landscape. So, you know, what I would say is that while rewilding in general, you know, on some theoretical plane could be a good idea, the kind of question of who's controlling the land and who's actually stewarding that process is absolutely essential, because otherwise, you know, we know what happens when, you know, the kinds of extractive nation state come in and are in charge of that rewilding.
Great, so unless there's any follow-ups, we can take questions from the audience.
Thanks for these rich conversations. I've learned a lot. My question is for Professor Dahbour, but I think I'm going to maybe try to route it as like a sort of general question for the panel. So, Professor Dahbour, when you were talking at the end of your presentation, you know, and you were describing the kind of not prescriptive, but the kind of system that you imagine commons being. It struck me that it has a lot of affinities actually with a kind of agrarian Maoism, and sort of minus a kind of claim about industrial potential on the other side. And it made me wonder when you were speaking why, like, what is the normative basis for delimiting the agrarian as the basis for thinking about commons? And when you said that, and then sort of reflecting on the totality of the presentations, it sort of made me think that, like, there are a lot of kind of presumptive claims that we've all been making today that kind of have come out in this panel specifically about how you read Marx on the secret of primitive accumulation, so-called. You know, I'm struck by this sense that there's been a kind of maybe sort of under commentary since Silvia Federici's keynote that maybe there's something sort of like that the appropriate way to sort of read or understand that invocation of commons in Marx and enclosure in Marx is actually as a kind of empirical story about something that actually historically unfolds and leads to a transition to capitalism and so forth. But that, of course, is not the only way to read that section, as I know many of you know, many in this room knows. And certainly, if you take a global perspective and you were to suggest that actually the kind of story of so-called transition to capitalism that unfolds in that chapter could then kind of be replicated and taken sort of to explain capitalism and enclosure on a global scale, that would be wrong. And I think that there's, and there's a lot of historical work, obviously, that sort of suggests that that story is quite confining as an explanatory device for any type of empirical phenomena, perhaps even in England itself. So I'm kind of wondering, in general, is if we don't take that section of Marx as an empirical account of some type of transition, does that then sort of allow us to actually think more capaciously about other types of practices in common, of commons that are invoked in Marx and other political traditions that aren't reducible to the agrarian and to this idea of enclosure that frames? Yeah.
Take more questions, or should I?
If you want to respond, and then we can, or if we want to take one more question to group two together, maybe.
So this is this on? Yes. So thanks to the panelists. That was super interesting. I think that there are some complementarities between our questions, so maybe it'd be possible to stitch them together. And I guess mine starts with Rob's talk at the end, but then I would also ask Ashley and Omar to weigh in, perhaps. Okay, so I guess I'm skeptical, or I have some resistance to the sort of approach of, kind of game theory, very abstract first and last man way of thinking about this. And, I get this image of kind of like a screen with pixels changing color one at a time until there's one left. Sure. And I understand the logic of what you're describing, but in many ways, it seems to me what's less important maybe than the logic of it is what you actually ended with, which is this is ultimately about enforcement and violence and state and other power. And in that context, I guess what I'm thinking about in terms of resisting this is you sort of end with this picture of, okay, like the sort of very last actors in this scenario are compelled to act according to the logic, by which they are structured and by which they are surrounded, which I take the point. But I guess I'm also wondering about moving in the other direction of if you sort of think in that kind of, game theory kind of scenario, your parable presumed that everyone accepted or had to go along with the terms of the game. And I'm wondering about active resistance to those forms of exclosure and enforcement. And so I can't remember it off the top of my head. I'm sure Nicole knows it, but there's this famous quote from Rousseau about, basically the first person to enclose a piece of land and get others to believe him critically is like the founder of private property. What if you don't get other people to go along with your acts of exclosure? And trying to connect some of this more empirically to the kinds of political movements that Ashley was talking about, but then also thinking about other political possibilities in this space, as Omar was talking about. I guess I'm wondering if instead of letting the parable play out or as alternatives to how it plays out, are there ways to actively push back against the acceptance of those rules and norms?
Maybe you all want to respond to those two questions, then we'll take some more.
Well, the second was really, I think you get first stab at the second question. As for the first question, I'm not quite sure how to respond to the second part of it about Marx. Maybe it's a topic for a longer conversation later. But you asked what the normative basis of the kind of agrarian commons is that I was seeming to advocate. And I would say it's the concept of livelihood, the connection of human livelihood, especially in settings where communal forms of food production are key, connecting that with natural settings, natural environments in which are essential, the goods and services, so to speak, in those settings are essential in order to maintain people's livelihood. That kind of close connection, and of course livelihood can attach on to other concepts, other ethical concepts having to do with a variety of things that would justify claims to common property in those situations. That would be how I'd respond, very briefly, anyway. Would you like to take at least the first stab at the second question?
Sure. So on the primitive accumulation question, I'll try to connect them a little bit. Yeah, I've written a little bit before about the notion of primitive accumulation and its, in my view, overextension to describe forms of contemporary colonial capitalist expansion. Because I think the general idea there is that people I don't even think primitive accumulation is a Marxist concept. I think he makes a big deal of emphasizing it's the so-called primitive accumulation. It's Adam Smith's term, the original accumulation of stock. And he's trying precisely to show that it is not a form of original accumulation in that sense. So, but the general point, right, is that the process by which capitalism emerged from non-capital is, in my view, disanalogous to the process by which non-capital is subsumed by previously existing or extant capital. There's really a significant difference between those two things, and it's just conceptually confusing to take the same term to describe the two of them, right? And this relates a little bit to your point, which I very much agree kind of with the general thrust of it, that the reason why I kind of started with this abstract sort of game theoretic idea is, but want to connect it to the second, is to suggest precisely that it is the second problem that makes the first, that reframes the first. The first starts not so much, I mean, the way I describe it is kind of game theoretic, but it is, the way it arises often like in legal disputes, because the form of the claim appears to be self-contradicting in some sense. It's like, we have a space here which cannot be turned into an exclusive territorial zone of control. Is that what that seems to be inherently contradictory claim. It was like, well, who would enforce this space and who decides that it's your space? And it sounds de facto to seem a lot like something like territorial sovereignty or landed property, right? So that's in a legal context, there's often people who kind of try to make the argument that these claims are in some sense self-contradictory. But I want to say the reason why it's not a kind of game theoretic or abstract problem is precisely that when you situate it in the other context, the context of real world existing power relations, that actually better explains why parties like that are driven into a position that sounds self-contradictory. And it has to do a little bit back to the primitive accumulation question in my view, because I think, and also a little bit with what Alyssa was talking about earlier in terms of thinking about Hardin's model as being, in a sense, an inadvertently accurate depiction of a kind of dilemma that is generated by capitalist societies, which is that if once one party begins to maximally exploit the resources of the earth for the accumulation of power, it pushes everyone else into a dilemma, because even if we do not want to accumulate and maximally exploit the earth, then we are probably going to lose against those people over the long run, because their form of life is organized around maximal exploitation and the accumulation of power. So we need to accumulate enough power to stop the people who would maximally accumulate it. And so that is not just a kind of logical or conceptual dilemma, it's a real kind of practical dilemma. If we don't value the maximal accumulation of power, we value other things. We have to minimally value power sufficiently to stop those who do maximally wish to accumulate power. That's the dilemma of anti-capitalist struggle, right? And I think that in general, that thinking about anti-capitalist struggle as in a highly, in my view, highly idealist frame, that what we need to do is just generate new ideas, is mistaking the nature of the problem that confronts us. It mistakes the nature of the source of the dilemma, namely a power dilemma, and therefore mistakes the source of the solutions to it, in the idea that we can just generate kind of new concepts. In my view, we have all the vast majority of humans have lived in forms of communalism, right? That is an overwhelming majority of human life has been like that. A tiny, tiny exception to the rule is the last 250 years that has, in a sense, exponentially accumulated value and used that in order to impose a particular model. And so the problem isn't coming up with new ideas, it's dealing with the power dilemma that confronts us with, how to generate sufficient power to stop those who wish to maximally accumulate power. And that's not a logical puzzle, that's a practical one.
Can I respond briefly to that? I guess, thinking about this, we're just going to have to agree to use different terms to describe the situation. I don't see the dilemma. I see resistance to enclosures or resistance to ecocide or extractivism as requiring political power. That was basically the argument in my talk. I don't see it as a dilemma. I think any collective action involves power. I'm more than well aware that there's a strong strain in, I don't know whether to call it utopian thought or whatever, that wants to see a society or a world beyond power relations. And I frankly don't buy it. I think that all collective action involves the use of power. For me, the crucial question is who's using it and for what purpose? And if communities, commons, organizations are using it to defend their common property against encroachments by private property, capitalist exploitation, or whatever, I'm happy to applaud that action, even though it does involve the use of political and means and sometimes even forceful resistance. So I guess I wouldn't use, I think we're talking about the same things, we're using different terminologies. I don't see the dilemma. I think it's a kind of inevitability, frankly, to political struggle in this world. And I just hope that struggle can be exercised for the right purposes, right people for the right purposes.
If I may just add one thing, which I think responds to your, or tries to respond to your question, James. I guess my model of commoning is influenced by autonomia, Italian autonomia theory, which I think informs Silvia Federici's comments, which sort of sees a dialectical relation between capitalist forms of enclosure and the generative capacity of communities, of labor, of women and other oppressed subjects to invent and generate new forms of commons that are resistant, new forms of community organized around autonomous reproduction of various different kinds. And so I think that's why I would challenge the idea that everyone is completely won over, which you seem to be kind of articulating, if I understand you correctly, because I think there's this constant process of articulating alternatives that takes place. And also I think one can look historically, at the point that I made at the very outset, which is really absolutely key to contemporary indigenous resistance, that indigenous people steward 80% of the world's biodiversity, despite 500 years of oppression, right? So obviously the kinds of ontological practices or commoning practices that many communities engage in have retained a great deal of resiliency across that, 500-year span of genocidal violence directed at those communities.
Maybe take another group of questions. I see 3 hands, maybe 3 or 4 more questions.
Thank you for this discussion. As you were all talking, I just put my mind goes about the encampment, and it's the logic of why you're occupying a space. Just be free to express yourself, which there's no. So it's really refreshing to hear these thoughts. My one question to Professor Dahbour is, you talked about commons essentially being agricultural, and historically, cities are the place of production and usually a zone, like a gray zone. I'm talking as an archaeologist that the city, the core, the temple, the state is more urban, and there's always a gray line between the city and the village. And actually, one of the biggest difficulties in archaeology is where to define the boundary of the city, because the production continues through all the space. So I wonder if you look at historically if that distinction could even be made.
let's take 2 more final questions, and then I think we're running out of time. So just brief responses.
Real quick, I think your question is Weber's question, right? Is that if these institutions are so hyper-rationalized and they're so powerful, and yet you want to lead a rich, meaningful social life, somehow you have to find a way to compete on their terms. And I think to a certain extent that's your question about the Nature Conservancy. I mean, do you want to talk about the ultimate capital P progressive organization? Boy, do they love property, private property and efficiency. Yeah. And this is what environmentalism has become, right? So much of the Big Ten are about rationality, efficiency, and property. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how do you fight this if you want the meaning? And I think one of the things, and it's some of my concern about the agrarian focus, there's a naturalism that is very, very common in discussions of the commons. And I worry a great deal when you focus on the ecological to the extent that we have. Because you can't separate the historical generation of agroecological landscapes, if you want to call them that, or urban terrain, if you want, from those historic, metabolic, always more than ecological, always more than human phenomena. And so I get driven nuts when the claim is that environmentalism is about nature, when, as I said a year ago, right, it's about quality of life. It's about place. It's about intimacy of connection. It's about social reproduction. It's about the kinds of communities we build and can thrive in. I worry when we talk about the commons if we make it too ecological, because it's always historical. And that's a subtext in something that everybody said, but we haven't focused on that historical moment, which is metabolic. And by the way, I hate the Nature Conservancy.
Yes.
Thanks so much. This is a great panel. Also learned a lot and many questions, but I'm going to try to keep it to one for each of you. And so first for Omar, I was wondering, building on this very interesting conversation and back and forth, if you could just be curious what it would make it possible for the kind of commons you're describing in this kind of form of sovereignty to resist some of the power dynamics that Rob's describing, and sort of to exercise this form of limited and functional sovereignty absent what seems like an enforcement capacity that other kinds of sovereignty might have. And relatedly, I'm curious to hear a bit more about the idea of the functional sovereignty and sort of like where that comes from. Who decides it's functional? It seems like there's sort of almost like a substantive element to that functional sovereignty, that somebody's sort of deciding this is meeting the grounds for the functionality. So would love to hear more about that. For Ashley, I found, I appreciate the sort of attention to natural climate solutions, and I would love to talk more about those with you. One question I had is actually sort of about a different aspect of functionality, and it's if, on the one hand, I do find compelling the argument that obviously, Landback and restoring Indigenous sovereignty would be a very compelling way of protecting biodiversity, but I worry if there's like a political challenge of making that almost like a functional claim, or like if there's a threat of that becoming conditional on, that claims about Indigenous sovereignty become conditional on sort of, are they adequately protecting biodiversity? And so how do you think about that? And, there might be strategic reasons to make that argument anyway, but just, would love to hear more. And then last for Rob, I love the excluders, and I found this whole talk very compelling, and I was just curious about, this excluding from the excluders when you're like the last man with the last piece of land. But I'm curious if there's ways to think about that as also being on. I think Alvaro put it as like on the offensive. To sort of extend beyond that little patch that you're stuck in at the end. So yeah, thank you all again.
If you want to just 2 minutes, so.
2 minutes for 4 questions, I'll try.
Whatever's most pressing.
The reminder from historical archaeology that the divide between cities and country has varied is, I think, an excellent one, and I didn't mean to imply any kind of absolute division between them. As an advocate of greening cities, I actually am, committed to, in some ways, abolishing that division, right? And I can understand how it's historically variable and so on. But I think to the extent that commons are urban, or maybe even, as I suggested, partly tongue-in-cheek industrial commons, if we can derive that from a kind of strange reading of Marx, I think the tie to sustenance and livelihood rights is a really important one that should not be given up lightly. I think that's sort of the basis, for me anyway, of a lot of what the common property ideas is all, or common property institutions is all about, sort of people maintaining their own livelihood and existence autonomously within a collective of some sort. So I want to hold on to that idea, but it can be instantiated in all kinds of ways, including in cities, as long as they're not perhaps the cities that some of us live in today, right? The cities would have to be transformed in some way. Let's see, the Nature Conservancy question. I'm not going to try to defend the Nature Conservancy, but I am going to try to defend the concept of nature. I just published an article called Why Critical Theory Has Forgotten the Domination of Nature, which I see as one of the crucial concepts of 20th century philosophy, in fact. So I do want to hold on to the concept of nature. I associate myself with a materialist approach to philosophical questions. I think once you let go of the concept of nature, kind of anything and everything is up for grabs. And I think, again, this would be a longer conversation as to why that is the case, but I do want to hold on to it. And furthermore, your question gave me the feeling that I'm surrounded by a bunch of urbanists in this room, which is something that I managed to ignore so far, but now I actually feel is the case. And I don't mean to make people mad with some sort of anti-urban bias. I've lived in cities my whole life, so, but sometimes it's problematic and sometimes it's enjoyable. Resisting the power dynamics. So my last point, I think, was that it's, I see common struggles as sort of two-stage. One stage is a kind of form of self-organization, so that there's I think, as Silvia Federici said, there's a kind of material basis for the commons to hold on to a sustained struggle. The second stage, though, I think, is a kind of constitutionalization of those common property institutions, and that's a struggle directly with the state to mobilize, to force them to recognize these institutions as a sort of alternative power center. And I don't want to kid myself how difficult that struggle will be, but there have been some modest successes on that score, and I think that is a way to give commons the ability to resist powers, in a way to turn the state against itself, which I understand is what wrestlers do, and other people engaged in conflict. If you can turn your enemy's power, divide it or turn it aside, you've got an advantage. Finally, for functional sovereignty, who's to determine which functions and how those are defined? Very good question, very good conceptual but also practical question. I think I'm just going to punt on that and say it'll be a political struggle, right? How those are defined, and I don't think the struggle ends. I think, to quote Weber again, politics is banging nails into hard boards. It's very, very hard work and takes a long time and is kind of never finished and so on. But I think that what I would say is that I don't think it serves the project of a commons to try to challenge state power directly across the board. I think that's a recipe for failure. But if they can find a domain, starting perhaps with some forms of common property ownership, and then moving towards larger questions of sustainability and resilience and the authority over that, I think those are winnable battles. And if we have to concede to the state will still be running the postal service, or they'll still be doing the diplomatic corps and so on, I don't think that's a negative. I think we need to pick battles we can win, and that might be one of them.
I think unfortunately we might be out of time,
Oh,
but
sorry.
it's a small enough audience that maybe you can follow up with the final questions in person. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.